Hello class, welcome to your lecture on Armstrong's chapter on the Post-Axial period, Mayan mythology and the Popul Vuh, and the fascinating contemporary individual Martín Prechtel. Armstrong's chapter on the Post-Axial period is fascinating, but again full of a lot of generalizations. She notes that after the Axial Age transformation of Hinduism from the Rig Veda to the Upanishads, an epic tradition through the history of Hinduism into the present day, that both history and external reality are seen as more ephemeral and illusory, and that Hindus feel more at home in the archetypal world of myth. She also notes that Buddhism is a deeply psychological religion and finds mythology to be an earlier form of psychology. And in this way, in the development of Buddhism, mythology remains quite congenial. This is an allusion to the development from Theravada Buddhism, the pure Buddhism or psychological religion of the Pali Canon or the teachings of the Buddha, into the global spread of Buddhism through Mahayana Buddhism, which indeed reintegrated into Buddhism many elements from traditional mythologies. Armstrong also notes that in Confucianism, in the Far East, ritual had always been more important than mythical narratives. So the history of myth in China in the post-axial period somewhat divides into a more official state religion rooted in Confucian ritual and piety. However, in the history of Taoism, mythology is more richly developed. Armstrong then asks in general about the post-axial history of myth in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic culture. She notes that all three of these great historical monotheisms believe that their God is active in history and can be experienced in actual events in this world. Did these events really happen, or are they only myth? Clearly, in most of the official history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, what may seem to the outsider as myth is taken to be literal fact. Now, in this chapter, purportedly covering 200 BCE to 1500 CE, Armstrong does not cover any indigenous religions. Her coverage of China, India, and Buddhism are pretty thin, and more oriented by the axial age roles played by Eastern civilization in the creation and development of all the major world religions. Almost her whole A Short History of Myth is exclusively about Western civilization and culture. It is about the West's reconstruction of its Paleolithic and Neolithic past, then about its great civilizations, and finally about its two main religions, Judaism and Christianity, and how myth transforms in them. Islam is also undertreated in Armstrong. So the main point in Armstrong's post-axial age chapter is to talk about how myth transforms in Judaism and Christianity. She writes, Judaism had a paradoxical attitude towards the mythology of other peoples. It was antagonistic towards the myths of other nations, but yet would sometimes draw upon these foreign stories to express the Jewish vision. Furthermore, Judaism continued to inspire more myths, and one of these was Christianity. Jesus and his first disciples were Jewish and strongly rooted in Jewish spirituality, as was St. Paul, who can be said to have transformed Jesus into a mythical figure. Speaking of the mythical versus the historical and factual Jesus is not intended by Armstrong to be pejorative. Jesus was, of course, a real historical human being who was executed around 30 CE by the Romans, and his first disciples certainly thought he had, in some sense, risen from the dead. Armstrong's point here is only to say that unless a historical event is mythologized, it cannot become a source of religious inspiration. It is the myth of Jesus which spread before the inception of historical Christianity. In fact, all three great monotheisms continued to use mythology to explain their insights or respond to a crisis. Their mystics all had recourse to myth. Mystics make a journey into the depth of the psyche by means of the disciplines of concentration that have been developed in all the religious traditions and have become a version of the hero's mythical quest. Because mythology charts this hidden interior dimension, it is natural for mystics to describe their experiences in myths that might, at first glance, seem inimical to the orthodoxies of tradition. Armstrong's point here is that myth indeed survived in all three monotheisms in the form of the mystical spiritual traditions that we now inherit from them. Armstrong gives a few examples. Jewish Kabbalism, it was unafraid to read the Torah mythically and symbolically than in the Talmud. St. Augustine developed new myths such as original sin on the basis of old ones in the attempt to create an overall coherent Christian worldview. And in Islam, there is a continual generation of new myths of separation and return to God from Muhammad to the Sufis. Note that Armstrong also makes an overstrong claim here that Sufism became the normative form of Islam. I'm not a Sufi scholar, but I'm pretty sure this particular claim would be in need of some revision. So while mythos continues to be central to all three historical monotheisms, it exists in an uneasy tension with logos and tradition, and all three owe a great deal of debt to Greek philosophy and Western reason in articulating their religion. So the point of this chapter is to chart the changing levels of indebtedness of myth and reason in the historically evolving monotheism. Armstrong singles out Greek Orthodox Christians as knowing all along that theology could never be entirely grounded in myth or in logos. Theology is a faith-based liturgical practice. And the vanguard of the Jewish and Islamic worlds eventually came to similar conclusions. In a way, the upshot here is that in Judaism and Islam, myth, while curtailed at times, was never fully devalued. It is only in the Christian world that the attempt to fully rationalize their mythology ends up leading in the modern period to a devaluation of myth. So let's transition now to Mayan mythology and the Popul Vuh. The significant dates for Aztec and Mayan civilization being roughly the same as Armstrong's Post-Axial Age period, 200 CE to 1100 CE. But what is different here is that Amerindian civilizations and mythologies had been more or less isolated for 11,000 to 20,000 years. That is until the era of colonization. Interestingly, Meso and South American mythologies are important for Witzel's reconstruction of the original Laurasian mythology. Major civilizations here, in some cases almost rivaling those of Mesopotamia and Egypt, include the Aztec, the Mixtec, Olmec, Maya, and Inca. Many of these major civilizations developed a writing system, but few texts have survived. And those that have survived have done so mostly in Spanish translation, even scratching the surface of the massive body of myths collected by archaeologists and anthropologists, or investigating the breadth of contemporary indigenous revivalist movements would take a whole new course. So we're going to focus on the most complete and earliest book of myths we have written down in the 16th century CE, the Mayan Popul Vuh, originating in the culture of the Quiché Maya in Guatemala. The early classic period of Mayan civilization is roughly 300 to 900 CE, but archaeologists have traced elements of Mayan culture back to 3500 BCE, and recent archaeology shows that the Mayans were building cities as early as 250 BCE. From 300 to 900 CE, the Mayans existed alongside the Aztec Empire, which was dominant in adjacent regions. Teotihuacan, its center collapsed around 650 CE, and this ushered in a brief Mayan golden age beginning from around 900 CE to the Spanish invasion. The Mayans were highly advanced technologically and artistically. They had ornate hieroglyphic writing, created by the priestly shaman class and written on tree, bark, stone, wood, and codex. The Spanish conquest of the Guatemalan highlands destroyed most Mayan literature. The Popul Vuh is the only significant surviving text. Here you see a picture of the largest extant ruins of the Aztec culture in Teotihuacan. This is a little bit outside of Mexico City, so next time you're traveling there, you should really drive out to Teotihuacan to see just how magnificent this structure is. It seems that the Mayans were predominantly an agricultural society, 90% of their population being involved in farming. This led to the flourishing of Mayan culture, but eventual overexploitation, an ever-increasing population, protracted periods of drought, which archaeologists speculate contributed to the decline of Mayan civilization. The world tree for the Mayans was sometimes visualized as a maize or corn plant. One of the names of the Mayan maize god was Yumcax, master of the fields and harvest. At Palenque, it was Hunahpuh, the one revealing sprouting. Even more amazing to visit than the Aztec Teotihuacan is the Mayan city of Palenque. I like teaching this unit because in 2004, while I was living in Vancouver, Canada, I had some friends who I tagged along with on a road trip, in which we went to these sites and also lived in Leon for a while with a practicing Mayan shaman. If you ever get a chance to go to Palenque, beware the bugs and howler monkeys, but also stay at Panchan, a beautiful hostel-like lodging complex that is inexpensive and has wonderful food, and is within very short walking distance of the archaeological complex and other wonders of nature. Most famously among the existing temple sites in Palenque is the tomb of Pakal Votan. This glyph from inside the interior of the temple shows the apotheosis of Pakal Votan, whose body, much like the Egyptian pharaohs, is imagined as buried and regenerating the green man motif from somewhere deep within a shaft that leads into the heart of the temple. Palenque is still today a very active spiritual place for Mayan religious practitioners. Here you see a river ritual very nearby Palenque. The textbook chapter on the Mayan Popul Vuh is excellent and further breaks down the major periods of Mayan history. Although the Popul Vuh itself survives only in Spanish and Quichua transliteration, there are some surviving codexes from the late post-classical Mayan period, such as the Dresden Codex. The Mayan writing system was glyphic, involving extensive pictorial signs as well as some basic hieroglyphs. Because the Quichua Maya had few natural resources like gold and silver, they were among the last Mesoamerican populations to come under Spanish control. This allowed time for members of the royal families to transcribe their old glyphic texts using modified Latin script, and the written version of the Popul Vuh was completed sometime around 1554 to 1558. So let's get into the text of the Popul Vuh itself, which the textbook chapter anthologizes from the excellent edition of Barbara and Dennis Tedlock. Spanish authorities routinely burned Mayan texts, believing they were protecting their subjects from the work of the devil. Quichua leaders in Guatemala were trained in the Christian worldview by the Franciscan friars, and they concealed a pictographic version of the Popul Vuh in order to protect it. They translated this text into phonetic Quichua in a Latin alphabet, reperforming the text with some meta-commentary. The text was lost until the early 1700s when a Dominican parish priest, Francisco Jimenez, found it and translated it into Spanish. The text was subsequently lost again until 1861. It was finally recovered and translated into German and subsequently other languages. Here you see a facsimile of Francisco Jimenez's version of the Popul Vuh, where on the left you see the Quichua writing, Latin script, and on the right a Spanish translation. There have been many more recent translations and scholarly editions, but probably the most useful is still Barbara and Dennis Tedlock's. They were an anthropologist couple in the 80s who apprenticed to a practicing Mayan daykeeper. Their work was considered a sacred contribution by the surviving Maya Quichua themselves. When Crittenden first read his photocopy of Popul Vuh to a Quichua audience, they performed a purification ritual over it that included waving copal incense and asking for forgiveness of the ancestors who had written it for disturbing them. The opening or preface of the Popul Vuh is particularly fascinating. The Mayan Quichua writers, trained in the Catholicism of the Franciscans and familiar above all with Genesis 1 and 2, as well as the Book of St. John, appear to make frequent allusions to those texts in defining their own sacred text and tradition. Writing, "This is the beginning of the ancient or earlier word, here in this place called Quichua. Here we shall inscribe, we shall implant the ancient word, the potential and source for everything done in the citadel of Quichua, in the nation of Quichua people." This reference to the ancient word or logos is obviously an allusion to St. John when he writes, "In the beginning was the word," but the statement is indexical and performative. This is the beginning. The Mayan term here can mean earlier word, that is, earlier than the arrival of the Christian logos and perhaps more ancient. Lastly, while the Gospel of John refers to the word as light and incarnation of Christ, the Popul Vuh authors refer to the word as a seed. We shall implant the ancient word. The word, Tzil, logos, or mythos of the Popul Vuh is thus associated with agricultural fertility, as well as with the potentiality and source for all the great deeds of the Quichua. Interestingly, Plato in the Laws also speaks of the word in plant metaphors. Words there are seeds of values and cultures implanted in the young and come to fruition only later as children mature and embody the meaning and value of certain words in their deeds. The Quichua authors go on, and here we shall take up the demonstration, revelation, and account of how things were put in the shadows and brought to the light, as is said in the words of the Quichua. The Mayan terms here, evaxibal, put in the shadows, and securibal, brought to the light, can also mean concealing or evening time, or unconcealment and dawning. The Mayan mythos thus describes a threefold method of approach to the process of evaxibal, securibal, namely demonstration, revelation, and account. Most simply, this sounds like we're going to prove it, we're going to show it, and we're going to explain it, but it's not even that simple. Jimenez has in the Spanish declarado, manifestado, and relajado. Understood in a Latin philosophical and theological way, this sounds a lot like the process of dialectical synthesis in scholastic theology, which involves a similar threefold process of tolerating, removing, and eliminating initial illusion, conserving, preserving, and including in the experience, as well as elevating, lifting up to a higher level of knowledge and its known. The Quechua terms here have their own complex metaphorical implications involving pulverizing, purifying, clarifying, organizing, and effective narration or tale-telling. Fascinatingly, it seems like the Quechua authors here are making an indirect allusion to the methods of Christian theology, but with a spin based on their own language and its more rooted or earthy plant metaphors. Speaking of the gods of the Popul Vuh, which they are about to translate, the Quechua writers announce that their gods accounted for everything and did them too, as enlightened beings in enlightened words. We shall write about it now amidst the preaching of God in Christendom now. The phrase amidst the preaching of God sounds a little sardonic. What do you think? Go on. We shall bring it out because there is no longer a place to see it, a council book, a place to see the light that came from across the sea, the account of our place in the shadows, a place to see the dawn of life. Our place in the shadows is again linked to Ivaxibal, the dawn of life, to Sekiribal. The hiding place would be the Ebal Siwan, or concealment canyon, where the gods were hidden away before the dawning. The dawning place would be the place or places where the founding ancestors of the ruling Quechua lineages keep vigil when the morning star and the sun rise for the first time, places that are referred to as Sekiribal. The authors then make reference to the original codex or picture book of the Popul Vuh. There is an original book, an ancient writing, but he who performs, reads, and ponders it has a hidden face. It takes a long performance and account to complete the emergence of all sky earth. This seems to refer to the fact that the original Popul Vuh is a banned book. The book itself is described as a seeing instrument or place to see. The purpose of this mythic seeing is also stated to complete the emergence of all sky earth, that is, to regain the vision of the first four humans, which can only be accomplished with the aid of the Mayan gods. The Quechua Mayan idea of writing the Popul Vuh down in a new idiom is understood explicitly as a performance upiosic, a performance in which the maker-modeler, named bearer-begetter, Hunahpuh possum, Hunahpuh coyote, great white peccary, coati, sovereign plumed serpent, heart of lake, heart of sea, plate shaper, bowl shaper as they are called, and the midwife matchmaker named Shmiakok and Shmukane. Interestingly, the Mayan gods always seem to come in two and multi forms, and they are described as both compassionate and intellectual, warriors or knowers of everything, whatever exists, sky, earth, lake, sea. And so ends the preface to the work itself. Everything we have heard so far is introductory, and now they explicitly, this is the account, here it is. The beginning of the Popul Vuh itself seems modeled in its transcription or performance here in its relation to Genesis 1. Now it still ripples, now it still murmurs, ripples, it still sighs, still hums, it is empty under the sky. Here follows the first words, the first eloquence. There is not one person, one animal, bird, fish, crab, tree, rock, hollow, canyon, meadow, or forest. Only the sky alone is there. The face of the earth is not clear. Only the sea alone is pooled under all the sky. Nothing whatever is gathered together. It is at rest, not a single thing stirs. It is black, kept at rest under the sky. Whatever might be is simply not there. Only murmurs, ripples in the dark, in the night. Only the maker-modeler alone, the sovereign plumed serpent, the bearers and the begetters are in the water, a glittering light. They are there, they are enclosed in Quetzal feathers in blue-green, thus the name plumed serpent. They are great knowers, great thinkers in their very being. And of course, there is the sky, and there is also the heart of sky. This is the name of the god as it is spoken. How does this beginning compare with Genesis 1? Well, for starters, the poetic language describes a scene quite similar to the one where heaven and earth are still in the dark before God says, "Let there be light." In fact, the parallels are so striking in some poetic formulations that we must wonder if the Quechua authors are deliberately setting the Mayan Genesis over and against the biblical one. What is decisively different in the Mayan creation myth is that the waters, or sovereign plumed serpent, and the sky are themselves two primal deities, a divine couple. So you could compare the sovereign plumed serpent, or Quetzalcoatl here, with her plumes to Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, or even to Leviathan. Interestingly, the sovereign plumed serpent is already described as comprising in her plumes a multiplicity of spiritual agencies or soul intelligences. She is the maker-modeler, but she carries in her plumes the bearer-begetters. They are there, they are enclosed in the Quetzal feathers in blue-green. They are great knowers, great thinkers in their very being. So the unified mother goddess, or serpent of the ocean, is in herself a multiplicity of all the souls or beings that will be born from her in the creation of the world. And how the creation takes place is no less interesting. Instead of divine command, creation happens as conversation and as fulguration between Quetzalcoatl and the heart of sky. Then it was clear. Then they reached accord in the light, and then humanity was clear, at least in their minds, when they conceived the growth, the generation of trees, of bushes, and the growth of life, of humankind in the blackness, in the early dawn. All because the heart of sky, named Hurricane, Thunderbolt, Hurricane comes first, the second is Newborn Thunderbolt, and the third is Sudden Thunderbolt. Note that the divine plan for Earth and humanity is already arrived at in this conversation, and notice well the heart of sky in his sacred thought marriage with Quetzalcoatl reveals a threefold aspect. Ted Locke explains how this threefold refers to Mayans' understanding of the process of fulguration, when lightning strikes the earth and produces rock-like crystalline structures known as fulgurites. Fulgurites are sacred to contemporary Mayan practitioners and highly prized. Also significant here, in light of Witzel's hypothesis, is that Indo-European sky gods such as Deus Piter, Zeus, Jupiter are also lightning and fulgurite gods, themselves mythically associated with a similar threefold process of fulguration. And lastly, consider the Western philosopher Leibniz on the world as a process of continual fulguration. The world with all its individuals, monads, or plumes are produced by, quote, continual fulgurations of the divinity from moment to moment. Fascinatingly, this appears to be precisely the Mayan mythic worldview. The heart of sky fulgurizes the plumes of the sovereign plumed serpent so that the world can come into being and evolve. The divine couple goes on to ask, how should the sowing be and the dawning? What is to be the provider, the nurturer? Let it be this way. The water should be removed, emptied out of the formation of the earth's own plate and platform, and then should come the sowing, the dawning of the sky earth. But there will be no high days and no bright praise for our work, our design, until the rise of the human work, the human design. Holidays and the bright praise of the gods that they bring seems to be their central motivation for the creation of the world and of humans. For the forming of the earth, they said earth. It arose suddenly, just like a cloud, like a mist, now forming, unfolding. Then the mountains were separated from the water. All at once the great mountains came forth. By their genius alone, by their cutting edge alone, they carried out the conception of the mountain plain, whose face grew instant groves of cypress and pine. The production of the earth, merely by saying the word earth, is again so reminiscent of Yahweh's creation that we must wonder if the Popul Vuh authors are strictly performing their sacred text or at the same time giving a commentary and variation of it in light of their learning in the Bible. The Mayans too were a bit logocentric. As a divine duo, Quetzalcoatl and the Heart of Sky are a model of teamwork and cooperation. They worry together, plan together, create together, and are pleased together and appreciative of each other and their work. After doing the basic terraforming, they start to plan the animals of the mountains and the guardians of the forest. According to Ted Locke's informants, the gods thought they needed wild animals to keep people out of the forest, and that contemporary Quiche still believed wild animals are the domestic animals of the deity. Unfortunately, the maker-modeler bearer-begetters are not happy with how the animals turn out. Why this pointless humming? Why should there merely be rustling beneath the trees and bushes? Talk, speak out, don't moan, cry out. Please talk to each other, within each kind, within each group. Language, eloquence, speech, the type that is capable of recognizing and celebrating creation and all its creatures, seems to be central to the Mayan thought. The animals were instructed to name the gods properly, but they just squawked, chattered, and howled. It was apparent they didn't know what they were saying. They were just crying out in different ways. When the maker-modeler heard this, they kind of did a facepalm. It hasn't turned out well. You will simply have to be transformed. Since you haven't turned out well, you haven't spoken well. We have changed our word. What you feed on, what you eat, the places where you sleep, the places where you stay, whatever is yours will remain in the canyons and the forests. Just accept your service and let yourself be eaten. Gods go on, after the failed attempt to constitute the types of beings they want with animals, to make 3 more attempts. Next, the maker modeler tries to make humans out of mud, then out of wood, and then we hear the long adventure of the twins, Hunahpuh and Xbalanque. The humans are finally made successfully out of corn. Each stage is highly symbolic and interesting. The mud people don't work out too well either. They simply lack solidity and are comically amorphous, easily dissolved in water, and incapable of reproduction. Tedlock suggests that the mud people may be a subtle jibe against the creation of Adam and Eve from mud. At this point, the divine couple brings in the advice of some of the more important bearers-begetters or other gods, namely grandmother-grandfather, possum, and coyote. The grandmother-grandfathers are the daykeepers who know how to choose auspicious days in the divinatory calendar, and Hunahpuh possum and Hunahpuh coyote are likely the divine twins themselves. Note, this is the first instance of the divine couple needing assistance, and it begins a pattern that will be repeated until humans are successfully created. The wood people are more successful than the mud ones, but still not quite right. Mannequins or wood carvings, kind of like human puppets, they talk and speak and they populate the face of the earth. And so are the first numerous people, but they're a bit like automatons and extremely inadequate. Their basic deficiency is that they lack character or soul and heart. They just wander about wherever they want and they don't remember their makers. And so they become a kind of cutout or experiment for the humanity to come. The wood people lack spiritual connection and a sense of the sacred. And here we get the Mayan flood myth or the apocalypse for the wood people. Here comes their humiliation, destruction, and demolition, and the heart of sky devised a flood for them. The Mayan flood as well includes several destructive monsters. Additionally, the wild animals enter the wood people's domestic space and share in the carnage. The wood people's own technology even rises up against them. Their faces were crushed by things of wood and stone. Everything spoke. Their water jars, tortilla griddles, their plates, cooking pots, dogs, grinding stone, everything crushed their face. This is a truly karmic apocalypse. Dogs and turkeys telling them, "You caused us pain, you ate us, now it is you who we shall eat." And even the grinding stone where the corn is ground, "We were undone because of you, every day, day in, day out, in the dark, in the dawn, rip, rip, rub, rub, right in our faces because of you. So we're going to do the same to you now." Seems to be a profound allegory or moral lesson about the type of people that Quetzalcoatl and Heart of Sky really want to see. If we fail to live up to the Creator's intention, then our domestic animals, livestock, and technology will treat us pretty much like we treat them. The problem with the wood people, and probably also us, is that we use objects and animals without a sense of any final sacred purpose, such as dedication and praise. All the wood people's objects have only a use value or utility, but they lack a ceremonial value, so their things turn against them. Imagine if our iPhones and everything we own and use suddenly decide to crush our faces. Well, this may have already happened. In the final scattering of the wood people, the stones, the hearthstones shoot out, coming right out of the fire, going for their heads, and now they run for it, helter-skelter. They want to climb up on the houses, they fall as the houses collapse, they want to get inside caves, but even the caves slam shut in their face. Such is the scattering of the human work, the human design, and for the Mayans, monkeys are a sign of this event. They are a sign of the previous human work. I don't know about you, but this is a really neat flood or apocalypse myth. It's just so vividly entertaining, comical, and profound at the same time. Also, it's pretty interesting that the Mayans saw monkeys not as our evolutionary ancestors, but as devolved, failed attempts at making humans. At this point, we learn of a great, arrogant, and ingenious monster god, Seven Macaw, whose light provided a sign for the people who were flooded. This could be the Mayan Satan. Seven Macaw is a god who produces his own light. I am the sun. It seems that a false theology is standing in the way of the creation of true humans for the Mayans. This leads to the introduction of the hero twins, Hunahpuh and Xbalanque, who defeat Seven Macaw, a bit like Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeating Humbaba. The next longest part of the Popul Vuh, the origin story of the divine twins and their subsequent adventures, including, most famously, a descent to the underworld, or Xibalba. Here you see the hero twins fighting Seven Macaw. Like the Egyptian underworld, the Mayan underworld involves many blood-curdling trials, ordeals, and tests, but before the twins descend, we get some backstory. 1 Hunahpuh and 7 Hunahpuh are ancestors to the hero twins, and the first did descend to Xbalanque, where they are killed after losing a ball game with the lords of the underworld. The maiden Blood Moon, daughter of the Lord Xbalanque, learns about the special tree in which the head of 1 Hunahpuh is buried. Blood Moon finds the tree and wants to pick the fruit, compare Eve, but as she reaches her hand, the severed head of 1 Hunahpuh spits on her and makes her pregnant. Here you see the Mayan sacred tree in the underworld in which the head of 1 Hunahpuh is enshrined. The lord of the underworld is pretty unhappy by this pregnancy from 1 Hunahpuh, his mortal enemy, but is tricked by his serpents, who bring him a bowl of red sap instead of the maiden's heart. Yep, this is the same myth as in Snow White. Blood Moon goes into exile, but is eventually accepted into the family of above-world gods when she proves that she was impregnated by 1 Hunahpuh, who seems to be here a bit like Osiris, a male vegetative divinity, and she creates the ever-renewing corn plant, and then gives birth to the hero twins. So the genealogy of the hero twins goes a bit like this. The grandmother-grandfather giving birth to 1 Hunahpuh fathering with Blood Moon, Hunahpuh, and Xbalanque, as well as with egret woman, 1 monkey, and 1 artisan. As Hunahpuh and Xbalanque grow up, they play ball on the course left by their father and uncle. The Xbalanque, or lords of the underworld, invite them to come play. Xmucain, their grandmother, has a corn plant which lets her know when her grandchildren have died. Hunahpuh and Xbalanque go through similar ordeals in their descent as 1 and 7 Hunahpuh, and they are eventually killed in an oven, cremated, and tossed into an underworld river, but they are soon reborn as vagabonds who perform miracles of death and regeneration. In their reborn forms, the Xbalans do not recognize them and again invite them to play ball. During this time, the boys perform sacrifice and revive each other as part of a sacred dance. The Xbalans offer themselves to be resurrected, but 1 death and 7 death are actually killed. Meanwhile, Xmucain's ear of corn has died and revived, symbolizing the return of the twins. The twins resurrect their father, 1 Hunahpuh, but must leave him in the underworld, again compare Osiris. When they emerge, they receive the sun and the moon as rewards and their companions, the 400 boys who become stars. Here you see a Jaina ball player from around 700 to 900 CE. In short, the divine twins are culture heroes who defeat false gods, are children of a true god and underworld maiden, complete an ancestral journey, die and are resurrected, defeat the lords of the underworld, and resurrect their father. Their journey to the underworld is full of corn myths. In fact, it is their genealogy from Blood Maiden and 1 Hunahpuh, and their resurrection of their father which enables the earth to be fertile and the best corn to be grown. And it is this corn that becomes central to the creation of true human beings in Book 4. Book 4 begins, and here is the beginning of the conception of humans and of the search for the elements of the human body. Note, the story of the divine world order and its pantheon has, by now, been fully narrated. The Mayan Theogony, history of the birth of the world and its gods, thus precedes in principle the Anthropogony, or history of humans. All the divine events and deeds were necessary to create the kind of world in which an attempt to create human beings will not fail. But what will human beings be made of? Of course, corn. And here the Mayans present a myth of the origin of corn in a specific geographical location. Split Place, or Bitter Water Place, is its name. Fox, coyote, parrot, crow bring news of the discovery of yellow and white corn. It is interesting that here the animals, who are a failed attempt, sort of make good with the gods by proving useful to them in the creation of humans. In any case, the grandmother Xmucain grinds the corn and provides the grease, and 4 human beings are created. The gods were so happy with the creation this time that provisions came out over the mountains, sweet things thick with yellow corn and white, taxte and cacao, countless sapotes, anonias, yacotes, nances, mantasanos, sweets, rich food filling up the citadel named Broken Place, Bitter Water Place. Having created the first human beings out of corn, the gods now provide for their sound nutrition. And these people talk, look, listen, walk, and work, and they also praise and thank the Maker Modeler. They are handsome, and perfectly they see, perfectly they know everything under the sky earth. In fact, the knowledge of the first 4 humans is so visionary and intense that they'll become as great as gods unless they procreate and proliferate. So this is a really interesting example of decreation of the human beings. The first humans were too perfect, so the gods blinded them as the face of a mirror is breathed upon. Now it was only from close up that they could see what was there with any clarity. You can compare here St. Paul in the Corinthians. Now we see through a glass darkly, but soon we shall see face to face. The Mayan version would be the first 4 humans saw face to face, but now see through a glass darkly. The first 4 humans are all male, almost mirroring the mythic male fourfold of 1 and 7 Hunahpuh and the twins, but it is not clear how human women come into being except that the same gods thought of it, presumably making them of the same substance. It was as if they were asleep when they received them. Truly beautiful women were there with Jaguar Quetzal, Jaguar Night, Not Right Now, and Dark Jaguar. With their women there, they really came alive. Right away, they were happy at heart because of their wives. We must again wonder about the relationship in the minds of the Popul Vuh performers between the original council book and Genesis 2. Here you see Diego Rivera's Creation, which depicts the stages of creation and majestic serpent gods who launched this event. In the final sections of the Popul Vuh, the first 4 humans go out in search of the light. In Toulon, they received fire from the god Tohil. The tribes travel, carrying their gods with them and watching for the dawn. Find the sun, moon, and stars and learn of their impending death, leaving instructions for their sons. The Quiché legacy thus involves a tradition of righteous ancestors who fulfill their duty to the gods as the original creators had wished. The last lines of the text are a bit heartbreaking. Everything has been completed here concerning Quiché, which is now named Santa Cruz. The last thing I'd like to cover this week is a highly unusual individual, Martín Prechtel. He was raised in New Mexico and born to an Iroquois mother from Canada and a Swiss paleontologist father. He lived a pretty extraordinary life by any standards. From the ages of 20 to 33, he lived in the high Guatemalan Mayan village of Santiago Atitlan, where surprisingly he was taken in by the village culture and its chief shaman. He witnessed the Guatemalan genocides of the early 1980s firsthand and lost his adoptive home, which you can read about in his first book, Secrets of the Talking Jaguar. Earlier, he collaborated with a few anthropologists and linguists on articles on Guatemalan Mayan culture, myth, and linguistics. He returned to the U.S. a traumatized and broken man, but gradually recovered his will to live, eventually making friends with Robert Bly and becoming a famous author. Since that time, he has published many books and become well known, even founding a successful school, Bullitt's Kitchen, which you could still go to today. However, he is still not at all engaged with by scholars outside of creative writing departments. Part of the reason is that his writings are so unfiltered and inflated with grandiosity and magical realism that it's hard to read them as nonfiction, even if they are, in fact. Here you can find the link to Prechtel's school, Bullitt's Kitchen, which from what I've heard from friends who have attended is a really amazing experience. Even Mary Oliver, the great American poet, writes that Prechtel's book is so beautifully written and wise, he offers stories that are precious and life-sustaining. Read carefully and listen deeply. I first wanted to include from Prechtel's writing the epilogue to his book, The Unlikely Piece. The fact that Prechtel looks white and writes about indigenous culture more than a generation after Carlos Castaneda, while also profiting significantly from his literary success, likely also contributes to the lack of engagement with his work in academia. Carlos Castaneda, who we will learn more about next week, was a UCLA anthropology student who more or less single-handedly inspired the neo-shamanism movement in the contemporary New Age before he was almost forgotten. Castaneda became a troubled guru with an ambiguous message beset by scandal. Prechtel's writing and message are very different, and he does not revel in the mysterious guruism that propelled Castaneda. Nevertheless, Prechtel's association through Robert Bly, who can be considered his discoverer, with the men's movement has also tended to make his work a bit off-limits to official scholarship. Prechtel's books are too long to read here, but thankfully he has written essay epilogues to several of his books that distill the main ideas. In the epilogue to The Unlikely Piece, Prechtel begins with a scathing definition of civilization. It refers to cultural phenomena that imperially accumulate by force a continually expanding territory with all its diverse peoples and lifeways, which then removes the indigenous identity of all its constituents in favor of a national identity and tribalist sovereignty. Ouch! What do you think? In what ways do you find Prechtel's insight and observation on the phenomena civilization true? In what ways might it be modified? Haven't civilizations developing from urban environments also given humanity an edge over entropy in the wild and the opportunity to free up a majority of their time? For Prechtel, civilized indigenous people is a contradiction in terms. Civilizations only adulate and admire humans of the past who can build big buildings, push their neighbors around with large, nasty armies maintained with huge stores of artificially raised food, and create complicated writing systems. Small, beautiful, and more sustainable, intelligent tribal peoples, to regain legitimacy in the eyes of their civilized oppressors, have often been inspired to call themselves by such strange titles as the 5 civilized tribes or the Hmong civilization. This is confusing. For Prechtel, the word civilization refers to big non-indigenous cultures that depend on slave labor 100%. Human slaves, animal slaves, or mechanical machine slaves, for all its functions, freeing up the people to live a life that doesn't grow food, has no indigenous identity, and doesn't feed the divine in nature with the way we live. Notice that the ideal for human life of feeding the divine in nature is fully in accordance with the Popul Vuh's understanding of the function of humanity. According to Prechtel, food is the basis of both myth and culture. Humans feast the holy in the wild with the beauty of their hands. All spiritual activity is either a preparation for feasting the people, or the holy in the wild, or actual feasting itself, and all indigenous spiritualities are feasts. Prechtel defines the holy as that primal presence that cannot live by human whim or containment, but is the motion behind the procession of all natural things in their particular going along interdependently, each according to their natures. A comparison of this to the etymology and definition of the holy and sacred in Western culture reveals that it is quite correct and in fact very insightful. Prechtel's concept of the holy in the wild seems to have direct connection to Mayan cosmovision in the Popul Vuh. The holies in the world are basically the big indigenous souls of the universe. I wonder if what Prechtel calls the big indigenous souls or gods are comparable on a Mayan scriptural level to the bear begetters or plumes of Quetzal. Also included an interview with Martín Prechtel on the unit for this week, where he somewhat retracts his usage of the indigenous soul, noting that people took it in another way than intended, so he prefers not to use it now. The indigenous soul, he writes in this essay, is the most original and natural reality. This could be compared to the Western concept of the world soul and to the doctrine of panpsychism. The world or indigenous soul, the reality of what things really are, remains for Prechtel within and behind the projections of reality that are generated within each civilized worldview. Prechtel goes on to make claims about modernity and how myth plays out in it. Modernity being defined as an era of civilization in which people are actually able to physically survive without the indigenous soul and its myths. Tracing the origins of modernity to mechanized agriculture, pharmaceutical sustenance, and urbanized industrial overpopulating, all of which are rooted in resource exploitation, he comments that modernity is the era in which humans come to have little or no, quote, mythic relation to the origins of what surrounds them, no knowledge of what feeds them. And he also traces the origin of modernity, interestingly, not to the Renaissance, but to the Axial Age. Modernity, as this book is concerned, begins around 600 BCE until the present. What the Axial Age in fact accomplishes is a distancing of us and insulting the indigenous core in all of us of what it means to be a human. Armstrong, you may remember, locates in the Axial Age a generalized malaise and sense of withdrawal of the sacred. However, on Armstrong's interpretation, we also owe to the Axial Age a more sophisticated reinvention of religion and birth of philosophy and science. In fact, our very individuality, as well as the great world religions. Prechtel's more indigenous-centric suspicion is very different. For him, the Axial Era response to the withdrawal of the sacred wasn't an unambiguous boon, since afterwards its systems of culture and civilization uprooted and colonized the world. The so-called European Renaissance was the beginning of the physical end of what was still more than an 80% world population of indigenously living peoples, plants, animals, and places. For Prechtel, there is no escaping from modernity into the pre-modern. His concept of indigenous soul explicitly denies any kind of return to a lost Eden. We are unavoidably in an all-or-nothing situation with modernity. Modernity has provided a culture of comfort, addiction, and constant growth, and we are stuck with it, but that doesn't mean we can't heal it. The healing of modernity cannot be legislated or achieved by revolution, but modernity can only be metabolized. It can, quote, only be composted through the grief of remembered indigenous integrity. Prechtel goes on to describe his concept of origins and having an origins. No, that's not a typo or a grammatical mistake. Prechtel wants us to try and understand the concept of origin in the plural origins, as each of our singular origin multiplicity. On this way of bending the English language, each of us has an origins. Prechtel's discussion of the language of being and to be in westernized versus indigenous societies and languages seems strange, but to the best of my knowledge is accurate. Indo-European languages, not just Latinized English, but also Celtic, Sanskrit, and especially Greek, share common roots for the word being, a being, beingness, is, and to be. You can read all about this in Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics. The focus of Prechtel's critique of the Western language of being is its related fascination, bordering on obsession, with a single origin story or a single true integral myth. So consider the following passages in light of our reading of Witzel's Origin of the World Mythology. It almost seems like Prechtel is criticizing Witzel indirectly. He writes, even so-called rational scientists who in the trance of this conscious irreality maintain a subliminal inherence and implied enforcement of the need for a single true integral myth of a people, and not finding one, which they never do, spuriously erect one from what they consider leftover fragments. This sounds so much like a jab at theorists like Witzel and comparative linguistics in general that it's almost uncanny. Amazing how much can depend on a slight difference between the origin and an origins. Consider the next passages. Scientists look for a single originating star, an original single explosion, a single universe containing multiple universes, a single genetic Eve as the origins of all humankind, a single ancestral condition for each flower, bird, lizard, all of which are implied in the language, but which also goes counter to the results of their scientific findings, that all things of the world and beyond have multiple origins and originations that simultaneously run backward, sideways, forward, and indistinct, and usually contradictory, at least in the to-be language lines and directions. Yet each of these origins must be held to be not only equally valid, but also equally necessary for the present. Attempts like Witzel's to construct unified mythological field theories always result in a synthetic merging of 1,000 divergent tales into a single spurious mythic continuum to rationalize themselves as a people with a single, sequentially aligned origin. For Prechtel, one origin story does not exist, nor has it ever existed. One story for all is the unhealthy footing of fundamentalism. Multiple origins are always the way of things. And in a very interesting reflection that seems to go back to the idea of the four grandparents and the Popul Vuh, for example, any person has one biological mother and a father who in turn each have their own mother and father. Here alone there are four vast lineages whose diverse directions go into the infinity of generations of divergent cultural, genetic, and linguistic pasts, with the one thing that holds them together as a single possibility contained in their descendants. Note, Prechtel does not mention the first four humans in the Popul Vuh or the four grandparents, but his way of thinking of multiple origins traced back initially through a fourfold of grandparents and a fourfold of grandchildren seems consonant with that Mayan myth to an extreme degree. Prechtel even has a passage in this essay on precedence, which we could understand as what Witzel called pathway dependencies, writing, "Precedence is the way a people, culture, animal, plant, or anything proceeds along in how it lives out its existence. A cultural precedence is the way a particular culture goes about being itself in all its characteristic cycles, habits, prejudices, fears, joys, and general motives. It also implies a direction towards which anything by its cultural nature is moved to proceed. This word denotes the character of anything according to its long-range motion. This is precisely what Witzel calls pathway dependencies, the astonishing ways in which cultures persist in both shared and unique mythic narratives, a culture's short and long-range motion. Lastly, and consistent with our course theme on reconstructing the female mythological perspective from predominantly male-oriented traditions, Prechtel speaks of the world soul or original natural context as the mother, the great female, holy wild. For Prechtel, any attempt to rematriate us back to the holy in nature is the beginning of cultural sanity and healing. The English word matter comes from the Latin mater, mother, Latin matrix, the womb of the mother. Prechtel thus understands rematriation as rematrixing, returning any exploited part of the earth back into the actual body of the earth and accordingly rematrixing the indigenous soul back into everyday existence. I've also included 2 shorter essays by Prechtel, the epilogues to Long Life, Honey in the Heart, and I'm going to leave their interpretation up to you in next week's units on myth and liminality, initiation, and shamanism. Suffice to tell them, these essays do an amazing job of distilling Prechtel's own mythic worldview and his critique of our American mythological narrative. In his essay on initiation rites or rites of passage, Prechtel speaks a great deal of what counts as initiation in American consumerism and the military. His essay, The Hopeful Voice of the Red-Eyed Desert Frog, explains how he understands the light and the dark aspects of mythology and what forms of mythic thinking and experiencing he finds essential for healing and vitality. Okay, that's a wrap. I hope you've enjoyed or at least been inspired to think a little differently than normal by this week's material on the Popul Vuh and Martín Prechtel. See you next week.